This is one of my favorite times of year, as so many people. It is their favorite time, but it's one of my favorite things to talk about is this subject of Jesus coming to earth. By the way, as we talk, if you have questions, you can just raise your hand or whatever and interrupt. We'd be glad to talk about it. But if you want to be a little more private or anonymous, you can text to that number right there, and we'll do our best to get to it this week or the next time. We're going to meet 2 times in December, not next week, but then again on the 18th of December. Christmas in your PJs. You can show up in your PJs unless your PJs are nothing. Then we ask you to purchase some PJs and come hang out with us. But we're going to discuss this subject in a couple of weeks. So it's going to be fun. This is the time of year that we call Advent. The season of Advent is not just a calendar with chocolates in it. Do you guys, anybody know what Advent means? The technical term. What does Advent mean? See, nobody knows. What'd you say? Incoming? That is a good explanation from a military man. Incoming! That's exactly what is happening. It actually means the arrival of a notable person, a thing or event, or just a coming into place, view, or being. It's the time when God arrived on the scene. And I love to talk about it. Some of my favorite people in the world are atheists and skeptics because I myself am a skeptic. Sometimes I'm an atheist, frankly, but I usually snap out of it before Sunday. Not always. But it's something where people will say, if God would just show up, then I would believe. And I understand that sentiment. What they mean is if I could just see, if he would just show up, shake my hand, we could have a discussion, then I would be good. And I get that. But one of the most amazing things about the God that we believe exists and that we serve is he actually did. He's not just some person in the sky far, far away that somebody made up, although for centuries, millennia actually, even as we read through the Bible and the Old Testament, we have a story of people who are trying to figure out that I know there's something more out there. I know there's someone that created all this and somehow he wants to interact with us, but they didn't really have a good picture, a good idea who he is. So God fixed that by actually showing up in history. Long before Jewel sang the song in the 90s. Was that the 90s? What if God was one of us? It's not Jewel? That's not Jewel. Who is it besides Austin Powers? I know he sang it. But who sang that? See, nobody knows. So we're just going to call it Jewel. Can somebody Google that? We can't continue. Before the end of our time together, we need to know. You may know nothing about Jesus, but you'll know more about... Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, I can see the video now. But anyway, long before that happened, what if God was one of us is actually something that happened where God, that's the distinction of Christianity, is that God actually showed up in a bod. Divinity became human being, God in a bod. We talk about that all the time. But it came at a time, it came as a particular person in a particular culture in a particular nation. This nation was Israel. And we'll talk about the backstory here in just a minute, that Israel was expecting some type of arrival. It was something that was predicted. There was just sort of something in the air, if you will, at that time, that there is someone is coming to actually deliver us, and we'll talk about the situation that Israel was in. But it was something that was being expected, and they had a certain thing in mind, number one, about who God was, and they eventually found out when God showed up that he was really nothing like they thought he was to begin with, and they really had to change their perception of him if they wanted to know the one true God. But at the same time, they found out not only that God was one of us, God wasn't who they thought he was, but this deliverer that they thought was going to change everything about their physical circumstance, about their national circumstance, which was not good, had something completely different in mind. And we have two authors from that time. One of them personally hung out with this person who arrived, whose name is Jesus, that you're probably aware of. One was a person that hung out with him all the time. Another person didn't ever actually see him in the flesh, but interviewed all the people that hung around him. And two of the authors, named Luke and Matthew, share the story of how Jesus came on the scene. They do it from two totally different perspectives. It's not one and the same view. And so this week, and then on the week of the 18th, we will talk about these two authors and their view of how Jesus showed up and what that means and why we should care. Now, we probably won't get done with this today, but we're going to start with Matthew. Now, it's important to know that Matthew's speaking to Jewish people. It doesn't mean we can't listen in, but his particular audience, and it's really good when you're studying the Bible, if you can know who the author is speaking to, sometimes it will shape how you understand it. And Matthew's speaking to Jewish people, his brothers and sisters, people that grew up with the same values, the same culture, the same understanding of the Old Testament, same understanding of the Bible as him. And he's trying to explain to them this person that you're expecting who they called a Messiah. A Messiah. It's a word that we don't use these days. This person that you were expecting isn't really anything like what we thought he would be. Now, the word Messiah, again, we don't use that word. We would use the word, and we don't use this word much, king. It simply means king. The person, especially in the ancient context, this is the person that would be in charge of everything, that would be who they look to lead them, to protect them, to direct their nation, and to give them this security in their national sovereignty. And to the ancient Israel people, if they didn't have a king, it meant that God was not on their side, that they had done something wrong. And that's the situation that they were in. But Jesus is not the king they expected. This is what Matthew is trying to communicate. But he is the king they need. Long before Mick Jagger, Matthew is saying, you can't always get what you want. But if you listen to me, you get what you need. So his kingdom is different and greater than any other, because they were expecting this Messiah to come in and vanquish their captors, which was the Roman Empire at that particular time in history, to lead an army in a rebellion against this occupying force of the Roman Empire and lead them back again to national prominence. That's what they were looking for. They wanted their kingdom back that they had lost. But Matthew's trying to communicate, actually it's better and bigger, and worldwide it's much different than you thought. Now, to help us, we're going to take a little, get the backstory on this. So we'll take a little historical journey, which I love to talk about history in general, but I especially love to talk about the history of Bible verses and scriptures, because they help us to get an understanding. If you know a little bit about how Israel became a nation, they were enslaved in Egypt. And as you read, this will make some people mad that have never heard this, as you read through the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, you get a story of the origin of the nation of Israel. It's not all perfectly, exactly historical the way it happened, but there definitely is historical truth there. It's something I talk about occasionally. We can talk about it another time. But the Old Testament is more historical epic, is how I would describe much of the genre. Something happened there that brought them from out of Egypt into what was originally called Canaan, that became the nation of Israel. Little bit of piece of property there in the Fertile Crescent that has been fought over for millennia, and they became a nation from a nation of slaves. After a while, they had settled into this land, and they had been ruled by different leaders. At this particular time, there was an older prophet, sort of the voice of God. This is how we learn what God wants to say. They didn't have a Bible. They didn't have God in front of them. So they listened to a man that they would call the prophet. His name was Samuel. Samuel's getting old. And so they said to Samuel, hey, Sam, look, you're now old. Your sons are not like you. Give us a king. As you read through the Old Testament, a central part of the story is, as Israel is trying to figure out who God is they constantly wanted to be like the other nations around them. It's a very natural human thing to be. We look around at other people, what they have. We want to have what they have. The people of Israel looked around at the other nations and said, hey, they have a king. We need a king. Why don't we have a king? This is the movie, not the movie, the show Fairly Odd Parents on anymore? Do you remember that show, those of you that had kids, where the dad is always saying, why don't I have whatever? That's just what this reminds me. That's what Israel was doing. They have a king. Why don't I get a king? I never get a king. So they were saying, give us a king. And basically, Samuel didn't like that because that's not what God intended. Samuel was displeased with their requests. Oh, that's what's bothering me, Joe. Can you put those, that's glaring in my face there. It was like there's something very different happening today. But anyway, Samuel was displeased with their request. He went to the Lord for guidance. So he talks to God, and God says this to them, do everything they say to you. The Lord replied, for they are rejecting me. God, from the very beginning, again, talking about the theme of the Old Testament, and maybe bring up, I'm sorry I'm directing lights and things, I'd like to see them a little more. They're in the dark. I'd like to be able to see if they're asleep and throw things at them. So that's good right there. They're rejecting me. From the very beginning, we have the story of creation, we have the story of creation of Adam, all that. God wanted a face-to-face relationship. God wanted nothing between him and us. It's just who he is. It's his very nature. Father, Son, Holy Spirit is this close, vulnerable. They were naked and not ashamed is the way that the first relationship was expressed. There's nothing between them. That's how God has always wanted his relationship with us. He doesn't need a church. He doesn't need religion. He doesn't even need a book between him and us. He wants to know us personally, intimately. Humans are always resisting these things, this concept, trying to set up structures between us and God. It's what religion in general is. But he says they're rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. It's a very sad verse to me that God's saying, I want to be your king. I want to be the God that you look to for security, for provision, for that solid feeling in life where you're rooted and you feel like you are safe and protected and provided for. I want you to look to me for that. But they are looking for a king. That's very important. That's the way Israel, and it's not just Israel. Israel is representative of all humanity. He said, ever since I brought them from Egypt, they've continually abandoned me and followed other gods, and now they're giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. See, Matthew is going to contrast the way that they're used to thinking about a king with this new king that actually showed up. That there's a different way about him. He even says, I'm the way. It's what Christianity was first called after Jesus' death and resurrection. It wasn't called Christianity, it was just called the way, because there was a different way about how they interacted with each other, how they interacted with the world. And so the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning. He said, the king is going to draft your sons and daughters. He's going to take 1/10 of your crops. He's going to take your best cows. Some of you are going to become his servants. This is not going to be good for you. They said, even so, we still want a king. We want to be like the nations around us. Our king will judge us. That word judge is deliver us. Our king will deliver us and lead us into battle. That's the way they viewed a king. It's important to know that that's the way that they viewed this Messiah that they believed was going to arrive to lead them into battle. That's what they thought he was all about. And the Lord replied, do as they say, give them a king. Then Samuel agreed and sent the people home. Now, who knows the very first king of Israel? You didn't know this was Sunday school where we'd have questions, but who was the very first king? Saul. So you have Saul. Was Saul a good witch or a bad witch? Was he a good king or a bad king? He was bad. Do what? Oh, he started, who said that? That's right. He started good, and then Not so good at all. He was very humble. He was a big, tall guy, but it did not go good. It went south in a hurry. What was the answer to Saul the king? Who came next? David. King David is kind of, as far as the Old Testament, kind of the centerpiece. He's sort of held up as the example of what a king should be. He was a man after God's own heart. He made mistakes. He didn't do everything right. But one thing that David did is he prepared Israel. He got everything ready for the temple to be built. He vanquished all the enemies around them, but he prepared Israel for a time of unity and peace. Because who came after David? Solomon. Solomon reigned for 40 years. There were no battles. It was a time of peace. It was a time of prosperity. It was a time where the temple had been built and God was with them. God came down to the temple. They had a place to worship. Everything was cool and kosher. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Times were good. It was because King David prepared the way. Okay? But king after king after king after freaking king came along, and they were really, really, really bad. And the prophets would come along and tell Israel, hey, you can't do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, and they wouldn't listen. So in 586 BCE, I talk about this a lot, it's the focus of the Old Testament, basically. What happened in 586 BCE? Some of you are thinking, I thought I came to church and I'm having terrible memories of history class. Is it what?
Dispersed?
Say the word again. Diaspora, yeah. Diaspora, the diaspora. There's actually multiple ones, but let's just call it the exile. Now, what happened? This isn't just history. This is everything that the Jewish people in the time of the first century when Jesus arrived, this is everything they're thinking about. We don't have a concept of it, but we would have a concept of it if, for example, September 11th, 2001, it's amazing to me that there are people now alive that are like, they're in college and they weren't even alive. It's, how old am I getting? But if during that event, instead of, as horrific as it was, several thousand people dying, we were taken over by Al-Qaeda, and we were no longer a free nation, and we were dominated and ruled, occupied by Al-Qaeda, and had been for the last 20 years. We would be thinking about being occupied by Al-Qaeda. We wouldn't have to have buttons that say, never forget. We would be living it. The people of Israel have been living it in the time of Jesus for a few centuries. Now, they were taken away to Babylon. I think this thing does a pointer. I've done it before, but I can't remember how it works now. Talk among yourselves. Don't I have a pointer thing? Okay, I have no idea. I seem to have started some type of timer. This sermon will self-destruct in 15 seconds. Oh, there it is. Look at that.
Well, would you look at that?
Yeah, I'm nothing if not techie. But they're taking over here to Babylon, where all I can think of now is born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia. You that are old enough. Who wrote that? See, you know nothing about the Old Testament, but you know that. Yeah, Babylonia. This is, now I'm thinking about Steve Martin and I can't move on. But this is present-day Iran, kind of Iraq. That was where they were taken captive to Babylon. They were there almost 70 years, completely gone from their country. In the Israeli mind, if we're not in our nation, their king was, the whole line of the kingship of David was destroyed, done away with, zip, zada, no more kings, zada, zip, nada, no more kings. It's over. They are now captive in Babylon, okay? To them, God has forsaken them. Now, this is where we'll pick up the next part of our story. And you're probably thinking, what does any of this have to do with anything? Frankly, I'm thinking the same thing, but let's go on. It was the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, the son of Ahasuerus. I'm contractually obligated to stop and have us quote that word together. Ahasuerus. Nobody names their son Ahasuerus. It's in the Bible. If you're pregnant and looking for a biblical name, there you go, Ahasuerus, who became king of the Babylonians. The first was Nebuchadnezzar, then Belteshazzar, and now we're down to Darius the Mede, the son of Ahasuerus. Darius is the king. During the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, you remember Daniel if you're ever in Sunday school, he's the guy in the lion's den. Daniel has been taken captive with the rest of the Jews to Babylon. He's there, but he starts reading the Bible. This is always a good thing to do. He starts reading the Bible, and he gets to the book of Jeremiah, the prophet. And Jeremiah, we won't go to it, prophesies that Israel will indeed, Judah will indeed be taken captive, and they'll be there for about 70 years. So Daniel reads this. He looks at his Apple Watch, and he says, it's been about 70 years. Although it really wasn't. It was something like 56 or whatever. That's a whole other discussion we won't have right now. But Daniel says, okay, we're only supposed to be captive 70 years. What's up with that? So he did something about it. He turned to the Lord God, pleaded with him in fasting and praying. He's basically saying, look, God, you said we would only be here 70 years, and it's because of our sin and things we didn't listen to you about. So he begins to confess the sins of Israel. As I was praying, Gabriel is also a character in the Christmas story. We'll find out. It's the same dude. Gabriel, whom I had seen in the earlier vision, came swiftly to me at the time of the evening sacrifice. He explained to me, Daniel, I've come to give you insight and understanding. Okay, stay with me. Maybe shake yourself a little bit because you're like, none of this matters. It's really boring, but it's really cool, at least to me. Humor me. This is where it gets sort of confusing to people. Gabriel is trying to explain to Daniel something regarding their captivity and the exile, because Daniel's asking about that. Daniel says, hey, we're going to be here 70 years. As is often the case when God answers questions, he goes above and beyond the actual question and starts talking about something bigger. That's what's happening here. A period of 70 sets of 7. It's not just about this 70 years and you guys go back to Israel. There's something bigger actually that's going to be happening. A period of 7 sets of 7. I've made you do history. I've made you do science. I've made you talk about Steve Martin and songs from the 90s. Now we have to do math. Church is nothing if not educational. That's 490. When he says 7 sets of 7, he's talking about 7 years. 490 years has been decreed for your people and your holy city to do this: finish your rebellion, put an end to their sin, atone for their guilt, bring in everlasting righteousness to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. And that word place could also be interpreted one. Gabriel's saying, hey, something's going to happen in about 490 years. Your people, the end of their rebellion is coming. They're going to have an atonement or a reconciliation for their guilt. Their sin is going to be ended, and there's going to be everlasting righteousness that's going to come in, and there's going to be a holy one who's going to be anointed. Now listen and understand, 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. Oh, I wish we could stop and talk about that, but we won't. We'll pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem. In a little bit, a guy named Cyrus is going to become the king, and he's going to tell them, okay, you guys can leave exile, go back and build Jerusalem. It actually happened in history. But he says, from that time when he says you can go back and build Jerusalem until a ruler, a king, the anointed one comes, Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses. It was despite the perilous times. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. To me, that's a great description of what's happening on the cross. It's over. What did he accomplish? But the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing, and a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. That actually happened in history after the anointed one was killed, appearing to accomplish nothing. 40 years later, Rome came in, destroyed the city and the temple. All this I'm explaining to give you a background that it was around 70 sets of 7. It was around 490 years from this time that we get this setting of the Christmas story in Matthew chapter 1. They're expecting a ruler. They know it's around this time, and they're expecting him to bring them back to their original status with God as a nation. So Matthew starts out with his story. And he starts out with one of those things that we call genealogies. Again, I'm contractually obligated to make this joke. Genealogy is my favorite subject, the study of Jeannie. If you don't know me, my wife's name is Jeannie. But genealogy is my favorite subject. But when we get to the Bible and we read these genealogies, and if you grew up with the King James Bible, what did we call them besides genealogies, you guys that are old-time Christians? What? The begats. The begats are where we fall asleep, we look to see if God is watching, and we just skip them all together. Because it's like this dude that we can't pronounce his name begat this dude that we can't pronounce his name, and it goes on and on and on. The book of 2 Chronicles starts with 9 freaking chapters of begats. Now, the thing is, if you are just, and this is the problem many times with understanding the Bible, we live in the 21st century, and it was written thousands and thousands of years ago. We try, the word is anachronistic, we try to place our values and what we think is correct, the way to do things, on these ancient cultures and texts. But they had a reason. It wasn't just to say, you know, Aunt Betty was married to Bob. Now, Bob's first wife, she died. Now, Bob's father was, my daughter Kristen loves this. I have to take her to old cemeteries sometime to see some of our ancestors. She loves the whole 23andMe thing. She likes to find out who our ancestors were. And so we think when we read this, oh, this is just Matthew telling us who Jesus' family is. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But these ancient authors had a purpose for it. And this is what Daniel is sharing. And hopefully what I'm trying to do is at least make the first chapter of Matthew, I don't know anything to do for you in 2 Chronicles. Although there is a reason for it, and don't make me come down there and explain it to you, because it would take hours and you would be so bored. But there is a really cool reason for it. But in the first chapter of Matthew, I want you to not just rush through it, and I want you to get what Matthew's trying to do. Put yourself in the first century. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah. Matthew starts off by saying, hey, this guy showed up on the earth. And man, there was something different about him. Let me tell you about him. But he introduces him right out of the bat to his Jewish friends as the king. Jesus, the king, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. And our eyes start rolling back in our head. Jesse was the father of King David. It's really important that of all the different people that Matthew lists, including a bunch of kings, he emphasizes that David was a king. You see that it says David was the father of Solomon. He wasn't the father of King Solomon. He's just the father of Solomon. But David is listed as King David. His mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Josiah was the father of Jehoiakim and his brothers. Again, Jehoiakim was a king, but he's not called king. David's called king. Born at the time of the exile to Babylon. Matthew just throws in the middle of this genealogy, he was born at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the Babylonian exile, Jehoiakim was the father of some guy that we can't pronounce his name, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel, who I always thought his name was funny. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. I'm skipping over lots and lots of verses, by the way, if you don't know. I'm trying to not have you completely fall asleep. Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Then Matthew, again, does a little bit of math. All those listed above include 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, 14 from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah. In this little synopsis, Matthew mentions 3 people: Abraham, David, Jesus. Who's the person in the middle? It's David, okay? But then there's the Babylonian exile. Now, if you remember Sesame Street, they had a little song. One of these
things is not like the other.
One of these things just doesn't belong. So, if we're talking about Abraham, David, Babylonian exile, and Jesus, which one doesn't belong? The Babylonian exile. This is what this genealogy is about. It's what Matthew is communicating to the Jewish people who are aware of how Jewish people use genealogies to say that the center of everything seems to be David and about David being a king, and it has something to do with the Babylonian exile. Matthew's emphasizing the exile and that Jesus is the Messiah, maybe like David. Well, another thing that Matthew's doing is there's 14 generations between Abraham and David, David to Babylonian exile to Jesus. They're all 14 generations. First of all, the reason I like to talk about this is because I hope atheists and skeptics are listening, because I love atheists and skeptics. And if you're watching online, just pay attention here, because this particular genealogy is one that skeptics use to prove that the Bible is not true. We cannot be trusted because there are more than 14 generations between Abraham and David, David to Babylonian exile to Jesus. They don't equal 14. So they say, therefore, the Bible can't be true because the information the Bible is giving us is false. They're Dwight Schrute.
False.
False. There's more than 14 generations. You're skipping all kinds of people, and you're using wrong names in the wrong place. This is not true. Once again, being anachronistic, placing values of the 21st century on the first century. He's not trying to give us an accurate representation of the genealogy. He's trying to make a point. 14, King David. He's using a principle, a form of literature called gematria, which means letters have numeric value. Just like Roman numerals. If you didn't study this in school, do they still teach Roman numerals in school? I don't know what they teach. We have Google. Why do we need to teach anything, really? So you have I, V, X, and L, of course, which is 1, 5, 10, and 50. Then there's C, right? C is 100. What is 500? D. Isn't there a D? There is a D. This will be totally useless information to you. But many say that there was never an M, that it was 2 Ds back to back where they were trying to express, hey, there's 500, and then there's 500 more, and then those 2 Ds became to look like an M. Interesting, by the way, this is totally, completely off the subject because I like to talk about the book of Revelation. When John says the number of the beast is 666, if you take the value of I, V, X, L, C, and D and add those together, guess what they add up to? 666. The Roman Empire is the beast. Anyway, that's another example of sort of using gematria. But gematria is when the culture at the time didn't have numbers. They simply used letters. If we didn't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we would go like A, B, C. C would be 3, D would be 4, and so on. Same thing happens in Hebrew. Well, David's name, in Hebrew wouldn't put the consonants when they would write the name, was DVD. DVD. Dalet, Vav, Dalet. When you add up the value of Dalet, Vav, and Dalet, surprise, 14. Now, I'm not this weird person that goes through and predicts the future because of certain numerology they find in the Bible. I think that's stupid and weird. But when it's there in the culture already, this is something that's cool to look at. Matthew is telling them because they're aware of who David was. Now, God told David that his kingdom would last forever. And the people of Israel, like so much of us, get it wrong what God intends. David, your offspring will forever be on the throne of Israel, an everlasting kingdom through you, David. But guess what? It didn't. What interrupted David's offspring being on the throne forever? Exile. God left them. That's what exile is to them. God is not with us anymore. Matthew's communicating there's a new sheriff in town. It's the new king who ends the exile. He's doing that with the genealogies to communicate to his Jewish audience before he says anything else. The person I'm about to talk to you about, he is the son of David. He's David's offspring, and he's going to initiate an eternal kingdom. The promise that God made to us years ago about an eternal kingdom is bigger and better than you ever thought or could have hoped for. The king has arrived, and now God is with us. Okay? That's the entire message of Christmas. And it's right there in the genealogies. And now you have to go home. And on Christmas morning, instead of your kids being happy and open presents, read them the genealogy from Matthew 1, because it's what Jesus would want. But Matthew says it this way. This is how Jesus the Messiah was born. His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph, but before the marriage took place, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. We don't talk a lot about that. I've talked a lot about it in the past. But Joseph, her fiance, was a good man and did not want to disgrace her publicly, so he decided to break the engagement quietly. Now, we read these stories and we think these are people walking around with halos on their head, but it's actually a dude that was going to marry this woman, and all of a sudden he has to tell her friends, she's pregnant. Who's the guy? The Holy Spirit. You know, this, you have to imagine being, some of you, all of you that are guys can imagine the conversation. By the way, Joseph, I'm pregnant. Well, there's one thing I know. You and I, we haven't, I don't know what they called it back then, but there would be certain words, very choice words, that we would use today to say, well, we haven't done this, so I don't know what you want to call it. But, so it's off. You've been cheating on me. And I don't know to imagine. To me, the Christmas miracle is what happened with Joseph. There's two Christmas miracles. He considered this. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David. Don't be afraid. And Matthew emphasizes again that Joseph is a descendant of David. Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So stop with those air quotes thing. It really happened just like she said. And she will have a son, and you're to name him Jesus. That's the Greek form of Joshua or Yeshua in Hebrew, which people that are way, way smarter than me and probably more interesting to listen to say that that's the sixth most popular name at the time of Jesus' birth. There were all kinds of boys named Joshua. There's nothing distinct about his name, but Yeshua simply means God saves, and he says, for he will save his people from their sins. I would like to talk about that, but I'm going to move on. All of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. Now, I spend time on this almost every year when I talk about this. I won't spend a lot of time this year. But there was a verse in Isaiah that Matthew is referring to, and he points it out. Look, this is from Isaiah. This is chapter 7, I think. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel. I always wondered as a child, nobody could answer me. I would be like, but they called him Jesus. They named him wrong. Why are they saying that? It's not about what his name is, it's about who he is, which means God is with us. What Matthew is doing, and this is where I say this all the time because I want Christians to not do stupid things or say stupid things, because our job is to share who Jesus is with the world. And Christians will say, You know, the reason we know Jesus is true is because he was predicted in Isaiah. Look, it predicts that Jesus is going to come. He'll be called Emmanuel. He was born of a virgin. Look, it happened. And people that actually read it and understand the culture talk about, well, actually, that prophecy wasn't talking about Jesus. It was talking about Hezekiah, who was a king at the time, who was going to deliver the people from this army from the north that was trying to destroy Judah. It wasn't about Jesus. And they are right. Isaiah had no concept. He was not talking about someone coming in the future. In fact, that word virgin in the Old Testament is not the word virgin. It's just young woman is going to have a child. The old-fashioned way. It says certain things about that child, but Matthew is speaking to a Jewish audience. They all know the story of how King Hezekiah was born and was seen as a deliverer of the people and a protector of this army from the north. And he's leveraging that fact and going back and using that story to describe what actually happened in the first century when Jesus came on the scene. It wasn't a prediction. Midrash is going back and repurposing the scripture to apply to a present-day situation, in this case, Jesus' birth. So when Joseph woke up, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded, took Mary as his wife, Christmas miracle number 2. But he did not have sexual relationship with her until the son was born. That's the second Christmas miracle. I think I said number 2 first. So this is number 1. He didn't have sex with her until after the son was born. Those of you that are raised Catholic or may still be Catholic, we love you so much. But Mary didn't stay a virgin. We know at least 6 more times her and Joseph got it on because Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. And Joseph named him Jesus. You guys have any questions so far? You only got like 3 or 4 minutes left. Okay, we won't get to finish what I was wanting to talk about. We'll talk about it next week. But Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking. Now, the wise men, it's actually a word. The word is magi. Magi is where we get our word magic. The magi weren't 3 old dudes sneaking into town on camels like this. We 3 kings of Orient are trying to smoke a rubber cigar. Sorry, I used to be a children's pastor. I have all kinds of songs like that. But these magi were actually, and this is where you may have to give me 2 or 3 more minutes. This is the point when I speak when I say you're free to leave at any time. You can even throw stuff at me as you go, but just give me a couple more minutes. The magi were actually kingmakers. They were kind of a combination of priests and senators from the empire of Parthia. Noted here, look, I can point at it. There's Parthia. This is Jerusalem. That's Parthia. The rest of this is the Roman Empire. They are astrologers. They're the scientists of the day, but they are also in the position in the empire of Parthia that they sort of oversee the selection process of whoever the emperor or the king is going to be. That's really, really, really important. You have this little point here where Jerusalem is real close to Parthia, but at the moment, it's in the Roman Empire. And they came along. Now, there wouldn't have just been 3 of them. It would have been a big group of them that it would be just like if the Supreme Court and the Speaker of the House came to Waynesville. They just wouldn't pull up in a Volkswagen, get out and attend church. There would be, for whatever reason the government picks this, there would be black Suburbans involved, lots of them. There would probably be sirens going off. There would be people on motorcycles. There would be Waynesville policemen stopping traffic. It would be a big deal. You don't just sneak into town when you're the Supreme Court and say, hey, we're looking for a new president, and people go like, was somebody here? No, it's a big deal. These people would have been accompanied by probably about 1,000 guys on horses, a security detail that show up to a place, Jerusalem, about the same population as Waynesville. It's a happening thing. It's not just camels sneaking in at night, guys with crowns on their heads. And they said, "Where's the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose," and I don't know necessarily what all that's about. We might talk about it next time. "We've come to worship him." Now, this is a big deal. And I want to ask, and then we will move on. I actually won't keep you much longer. So I love to talk about this. But how did the Magi, how did the wise men know that there's a king of the Jews? No matter what the star is, if it's an alignment of Jupiter and Saturn and Mars that makes it brighter, I have no earthly idea. But why did they look up at the star and go, there's a new star. I bet we should go to Jerusalem and see if there's a new king. What in the world? Why did they do that? Why did these wise men, these magi, the senators and priests from the kingdom of Parthia, show up because they saw a star? Well, here's why. And then we'll talk about it next week. Going back to Daniel, you remember Daniel? We left him in exile in Babylon. But while he was in exile in Babylon, he became a prominent leader because of various things that God did to promote him. Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. Daniel, hundreds of years before these wise guys showed up, was in charge of teaching. If you read in Daniel 1 and 2, you remember Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You guys, the bunny, you've seen VeggieTales? Okay, you remember those guys? The whole thing was, those first names were their Hebrew names. The second names was their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, I think. What was Daniel's Babylonian name? Did you know he had one too? But we still call him Daniel. I'll give you $1,000. No, I won't. Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar, yeah, sure. Sure, he lied right here in church. But Daniel, eventually, because this was like the graduate school of Babylon. The smartest and best went to learn all the science and knowledge that the Babylonians had, which was vast for that particular time. Daniel eventually became the dean of the school, and he's teaching all the wise men. Now, we just read, and we'll end with this, we just read that Gabriel appeared to Daniel later in the story and says, listen, about 490 years from now, there's going to be a ruler that's going to arise for your nation. Be watching. So Daniel shares that information with the wise men that he's teaching, says, you need to be watching for this. Be looking to the west, because eventually something is going to happen in Israel, and a ruler that's going to have an eternal kingdom is going to arrive in Jerusalem. You guys need to be watching for this. The reason they showed up is because they learned it from Daniel, and it was passed down for years and years. And as history would have it, Parthia, I have to tell at least this part, because see, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this. Why would Herod be deeply disturbed? And everyone in Jerusalem was deeply disturbed. See, it wasn't just three wise guys sneaking in on camels. There was a big commotion. Everybody's disturbed over this because there's this buffer zone in between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire, and there had been multiple skirmishes. In fact, 30 years prior, Herod had been driven out by the Parthian army, forced out of power. Herod is deeply disturbed that these guys are in town and they're talking about a new king because the emperor of the Parthian Empire has recently, I can't remember if he died or was deposed, but they're in the market for a new king. And these wise men show up saying, hey, I hear there's a new king. And Herod thinks that they are ready to rumble. So everybody's deeply disturbed. Okay? And that's just where we're going to stop. What happened in church today? I don't know, but we're supposed to be deeply disturbed. And frankly, I am. But this is the setting, the reason that the wise men are there, and it all points to the fact that if you're from Parthia or if you're from the Roman Empire, Jesus is not the king that you are looking for. But he is the king that you need. That Matthew will go on to talk about. We'll talk about that next week. That Jesus initiates a new type of kingdom that is eternal, that we're all invited into.